Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to continue our discussion about the Iron Age. Our time frame for today is the 9th century, which is 800 BC to 701 BC. So, let's begin with the Greeks. We talked a little bit about how the Greeks had begun colonizing the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. They were pushed out of Greece, probably by population pressures and a lack of arable land, and they settled all over the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. They settled in Spain around this period of time. It's also around this period that we get Greeks founding cities in southern Italy. So they found a colony in Messina and Syracuse in Sicily. Pythagoras, who we'll have a lot to say about later, was one of these southern Italian Greeks. Meanwhile, the Etruscans move into Italy. These people would precede the Romans, and the Romans would ultimately absorb the Etruscans and some of their culture. The traditional foundation of the city of Rome, under Romulus and Remus, the mythical twins who were suckled by the she-wolf that lived around the Capitoline Hill. This is traditionally dated to the year 753 BC. Now, for those of you who have read the Aeneid, or have some knowledge of that epic, you might ask yourself, well, didn't Aeneas found Rome after the sack of Troy, which we could put in our chronology around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, when the sea people were raiding about? This is indeed so, and the ancients were aware of this problem. So what they did to reconcile these two myths, the myth of the foundation of Rome by Aeneas and his son, and the myth of the foundation of the city of Rome by Romulus and Remus, was by saying that Aeneas founded the people of Rome, the gens, the race, which would ultimately inhabit the region. These have, traditionally and mythologically speaking, Trojan origins. The city itself, with its fortifications around the 7 hills of Rome, this was founded by Romulus and Remus. So, the people were founded by Aeneas. The city itself was founded by Romulus and Remus. Now, a general statement about this period of time. We live in an era of nations, of large land masses delineated by governments, which encapsulate many cities. During this period, after the Bronze Age collapse, after the collapse of empires, most powers which are flexing muscle around the Mediterranean are what we call city-states. The largest unit of control is the city-state, the polis, to use a Greek term. Now, to use a term like Greek is somewhat misleading, because these people were by no means unified. They were perennially at war with one another. They shared in a common language and in a common religion, but they didn't necessarily share common interests. They were in constant competition. One could say that the polis was the tribal structure pushed to its absolute limits in terms of population. So what we have covering the Mediterranean right now is a patchwork of interlocking city-states which trade with one another, which go to war with one another, which have all sorts of cooperations and conflicts. Now, imperial power, which would ultimately band these city-states together into one giant confederacy, this won't come to Greece until the rise of Athens, and that will only happen as a defensive mechanism to repel Persia, which itself had conglomerated all of its many disparate city-states into one large power. So a big part of extending the power of these little pockets of city-states was to found colonies, to found new city-states with people strictly chosen from the old mother cities. So, for example, the Spartans found Taranto in southern Italy. Around this time, we get the first Mycenaean War. The Mycenaeans were a state, a city-state of their own, and they were subjugated by Sparta in this period. Sparta was a very militant and military-oriented culture, and they sacked Messenia and took the entire city as slaves. Now, in order to keep them in check, they let them keep their city. But from this point onward, Sparta would ritually raid Messenia every year. They would orchestrate an entire campaign of terror to keep Messenia in check. When a young boy had come of age in Sparta, it was his duty to go into Messenia, the city, from Sparta, and murder a Messenian. This kept population in check so that the Messenians could never really gain power over the Spartans. This also terrorized them. They lived in constant fear under their oppressors. Through this system of mass slavery, of enslaving an entire city-state, Sparta gained hegemony in the Greek mainland. And this is a good example of how things are going to work in the Iron Age. One city-state will attack another and deport its entire population, assimilating it into their own as slaves, using their well-educated members of society as house slaves to teach their children, and using the non-educated slaves for labor. We see this happening in the Near East with Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria, whose dates are 746 to 727, when he subjugates Syria and Philistia, deports their people. So what we have here is the origins of terrorism. The founders of terrorism, of using fear as a means to control, are governments. Some of the terror tactics that these Near Eastern kings would use were really, truly horrendous. They would hang people on poles, skin them alive, let them dry out in the sun, as a message to anyone who would question authority. They would inject into their very education system, into the very education system of their children, a system of terror to keep people in line. Now, all the greatness of Greece, of classical Greece, that we traditionally think of, yeah, it was built on the back of brilliant artists and engineers and philosophers, but the polis system was also a system which could not function without at least a third of the population being enslaved. And this would continue down until today. Now, we don't have nominal slaves, but to say that a third of our population, at least, are not embedded in some form of slavery is to have your eyes closed. Terrorism is a government production. It is created by the government in order to keep slaves in check. Never, ever forget that. It begins here and it doesn't end. Now, in your day-to-day life, who peddles more fear to you? The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, these kinds of groups? Or the people who control what you watch and what you read? Who tells you you are inadequate? Who tells you you cannot act freely? Who tells you you need to dress a certain way, you need to eat a certain way, you need to walk on the sidewalk, you need a job with a pension so you won't wind up diseased in a ditch somewhere? Who tells you you need a formal education? You need to fork over enormous sums of money for a piece of paper that will ensure that you have a job that will feed and clothe and protect you? Who threatens you with force and imprisonment, and depending where you live, with capital punishment, if you decide not to abide by this system? It certainly isn't Al-Qaeda. It certainly isn't Boko Haram or ISIS. They have their motives, but the pressure, the average pressure that one feels, that doesn't come from them. The stress we live with our day-to-day lives to make ends meet, where does that come from? Think about that. In our universe, there are two forces at work. One which expands consciousness, and one which contracts it. The expansive force of consciousness is love, and the contractual force is fear. If you live in fear, you live in a state of non-action. If you live in a state of love, your actions will abound. There are many laws at work in our world, some of which are good, some of which fall in line with natural law and are there in order to ensure a cosmic or an orderly unfurling of affairs. Most laws, however, laws designed by men, are there to terrorize you. They're there to strip away the produce of your labor. You make it, we take it. So know that. Know that terrorism is the chief tactic employed by governments, and it has long been this way. Fear is the weapon of disempowerment. It is the weapon which culture employs. Culture which is not your friend. Culture which is that nagging voice in the back of your head which some people mistake to be themselves. That nagging voice which says, you're not good enough. Who are you? What kind of power do you have to make a change in this world? It's bullshit. That is the voice of culture, and it is a poison in your soul, telling you that you are disempowered. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you something. You have more power than you could ever imagine. Through your words, through your actions, even through your thoughts. Don't let culture disempower you. We need to push the envelope of imagination. We need to push the envelope of courage. We need to shed the fetters of tradition. Because the way things have gone is not good enough. It wasn't good enough then, and it isn't good enough now. They're mind-forged manacles, like the William Blake poem says. Call it what it is. Call it bullshit. And live free of that fear, and do not peddle it onto others. Empower one another. Love one another. That is the expansive force of consciousness. Find your will. Your true will, and perform it. Do it. Something tells me that your will is not making profit for someone else so they can build a mansion on some Pacific island, add a sixth Lamborghini to their collection. Find your true will and act upon it. Not your base desires, not what feels right in the moment, necessarily. Your true will. Your purpose in the universe. If the universe is a brilliantly complex machine, find out what kind of cog you are within it, and play that role. The great occultist Aleister Crowley said, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will." Love is the law. Now that doesn't mean you love indiscriminately to the point where that love is dissipated and weak. That's where the adage, love under will, comes from. Once you've found your true will, your purpose in the universe, love in accordance with that, so that you might fulfill your purpose and not be aimlessly dissipated or taken advantage of. Love the right people. Love the right causes. Love with purpose toward something greater. Because it is the expansive force of consciousness. And it's ultimately what's going to get us out of this mess. This mess of civilization. This mess of culture. This mess of a mind plagued by the chains of language and the chains of fear, which are imposed from the top down to disempower you, to stop you from doing your will, to redirect you into doing someone else's will. Or should I say someone else's desire? Because true will is always in accordance with love. Now, I know that I said in a previous session that we shouldn't discriminate in our love. That we should love every individual. And I still stand by that. But often, loving is a matter of leaving people alone. Minding your own business. What I'm trying to say is that you can love a person, the human being, the soul that rests within that person, that is that person. You can love them. You can apply that expansive force of consciousness toward them. But you don't have to support their cause. You do not have to support all their desires, or even their true will necessarily, if it conflicts with yours. Conflict is a sign of health. If you had a body with no white blood cells to fight off infections, to engage in conflict within your body, you would die as an organism. Conflict is good if it is done with the right purpose in mind. So, I should say, love indiscriminately, but know that sometimes loving is a matter of minding your own business. At other times, loving is tough love. It is drawing the line on someone's childish desires, someone's selfish desires, and saying enough for the good of everyone, for the good of the whole. Inevitably, we will come back to this. There is much, much more to say on this topic. In the meantime, let's get back to our chronology. Okay, so let's talk about literature for a minute. Around this time, we have records of the earliest Chinese poems being contained in the Book of Songs. We get the Egyptian fable of the battle between the head and the belly. The Syrian language, the language spoken in Syria, changes from Phoenician to Aramaic. And this is on account of the conquests of Tiglath-Pileser III. Aramaic would become the dominant language in the Near East down until the time when Jesus Christ allegedly lived. So first century AD. Just a quick note on AD, BC, BCE, CE. In academia, these are relatively interchangeable terms. Most people don't care which one you use. AD stands for Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, and therefore it is a somewhat loaded term, so some people shy away from it. Nevertheless, that's what that scale of time is based around. So, to replace it with some arbitrary system like current era and still use the same numbers as the AD system is, to me, fairly silly. Calendars have always been in the hands of religious experts. So, to me, it's not such a big deal. I don't find it so necessary to bring iconoclasm to our calendar. So I will use BC AD, and if that bothers you, well, you can just pretend that I'm using before current era and current era, because the difference is totally negligible. So in Greece, around this period, we have Hesiod. He's a Greek poet from Boeotia, and he's known for the Theogony, which is an account of the creation of the world and the lineage of gods, starting with chaos and love, the expansive force of consciousness, and Gaia, earth, or material matter, Mater, the mother. Embedded in this account is the story of the subjugation of the pre-Indo-European religion to the Indo-European religion. Zeus, the patriarchal sky father, becomes master in this account. The word Zeus itself in Greek just means sky. Zeus, sky. Jupiter, sky father. Dios, Dieu. Theos. All of these words are etymologically related, and they all come from the word sky. This is the story of how the earth became subject, became married to the sky, and everything else that happened before it. This is one of the later portions of the story. There's a story of the overthrow of previous generations, the genealogy of gods, and how one later generation would overthrow the earlier. So we have the rule of Kronos first, time, who eats his children because time devours all, and his son, Uranos, heaven. This is etymologically related to our word urine through the concept of rainwater. Uranos conquers his father, time. The heavens conquer time. And eventually, Zeus, the sky, the great blue sky, the vault of heaven above us, conquers the external heavens. It's almost as if Zeus is the atmosphere which blankets the earth and protects it from the void beyond, the chaos, the endless ocean of time and space itself. Parallel to this, Hesiod defines 5 classical ages. In the Hindu system, these are known as the yugas. These are ages. We live today in the Hindu system in the Kali Yuga, which is the darkest and most dismal age. This has astrological implications. It's based on the precession of the equinoxes, the great Platonic years. So Hesiod gives us 5 ages. There was the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Heroic Age, and the Iron Age. So this was the conception of time, which Hesiod had. So the Golden Age was the time of Chronos, the time of time itself. The land gave good harvests. Hesiod couldn't even conceive of a time before agriculture, but in order to get these harvests, man didn't even have to work. The food just grew bountifully. There were no problems, there was no old age, because man lived in a timeless state. People lived responsibly, and they had quiet and happy lives. He said they ended their lives by vanishing like a dream. There was no fear of death. Following the Golden Age came the Silver Age, and this was a slightly inferior age. This is when human stupidity began to cause problems. Human lifespan was reduced to 100 years. People were immature, irreligious, and violent. This would be, if we have to compare it to an actual period of time, this would probably refer to the Neolithic, the period when Indo-European warriors were roaming the land on horseback, spreading their crops, extending their territories. Following this period, we have what Hesiod calls the Bronze Age, where men sprung from ash trees. They were warlike. They plundered each other's land. Men were mighty, strong, forceful. They used bronze weapons to kill one another. And ultimately, they died anonymously. Following the Bronze Age, we have a sort of hiccup. We have a throwback to a better time. This is the Heroic Age, the age of myth and legend in the Greek conception of time. Men were braver than in the previous generations. This is the time when gods and men bred together to create demigods. People were far traveled. They died in war and at sea. But when some died, they went to the Islands of the Blessed, which is where Achilles goes when he dies, in some accounts. In other accounts, he descends to Hades as a gibbering shade, and tells Odysseus that he would rather be the slave of a landless peasant than be a shade among the dead. We'll come back to this when we talk about mystery cults. So this Heroic Age was the temporary halt in the decline of man. Nevertheless, it didn't last forever, and following the Heroic Age, we have the Iron Age, which is the age in which Hesiod lived. Now, in order to get a conception of the Iron Age, we need to go to another work that is allegedly composed by the poet Hesiod. And this is called Works and Days. Now just listen to the title of this work. Works and Days. Life is humdrum. Nothing really changes. All we have is our work and our limited days. And it is best to enjoy that, to live in that silent freedom, and not waste our time in politics, not waste our time in involvement with worldly affairs, because ultimately it's just works and days. This type of attitude would be recapitulated for a long time to come, especially in the Epicurean works of the Roman Golden Age poets. Poets like Horace, who would write about the simplicity of the countryside, away from the bustling, smoky streets of Rome. So we have the Theogony, and we have works and days. These are both educational poems. They're written in a so-called Homeric style, which means that they amalgamate a handful of Greek dialects. They're not written in any specific style. We also get the beginning of Greek ekphrasis beginning here. Ekphrasis is a written work based on the description of a visual object. So in this case, we have the shield of Heracles. Another very popular ekphrasis is the shield of Achilles, which is a cosmological picture of the world. It's a cosmology. Homer describes how engraved on Achilles' shield is a picture of the earth, the sky, and the sea, the moon and the constellations. Two cities full of people, in which one, a wedding is taking place, and in which another, a siege is underway. The shield has an ambush and a battle on it. On the shield there's also a field being plowed for the third time. A king's estate where harvests are being reaped. There's a vineyard full of grape pickers. There's a herd of straight-horned cattle. But the lead bull has been slain by a pair of lions, which a shepherd and his dog are trying to beat off. There's a picture of a sheep farm. There's a dancing floor full of young men and women locked in dance. And then surrounding all of that is the great stream of the ocean, which the ancients believed flowed around the entire world. So this is an encapsulation of the entire world, and this sort of diagram would become very popular in various forms. I'm a great fan of much later alchemical works, which would depict pictures of the cosmos condensed down into one image. In a way, what I'm trying to do now with this project is give a cosmology of the world. A limited cosmology, but a cosmology nonetheless. The shield presents a number of contrasts. So there's war and peace, work and leisure. This is what would eventually come to be called the Hegelian dialectic, dialectical materialism, that history moves forward as a result of conflict, and that prior to conflict there was no history, so to speak. You have a thesis, an idea, a concept. This could be a city or a religion. And you have its antithesis, with which it does battle. Ultimately, these two fuse together, become a synthesis, and move on. And this is how history will progress. Through this constant balance back and forth between opposites. This is the principle of polarity at work, the Hermetic principle. So this is a form of wisdom literature. This Works and Days, the poems of Homer, the battle between the head and the belly, the Egyptian fable. At the same time, we start getting a collection of the sayings of Solomon. Solomon is essentially the Hermes Trismegistus of the Jewish people. He is the author of all wise works. He is a fountain of wisdom. He is the model sage, the model wizard. If you know anything about Solomon's Key, which is a much, much later work, we see this tradition of Solomon as a wizard, as a man who can bind demons through magic. It's during this time that the prophets Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah fight religious and social abuses in Israel. They are embedded in a world of conflict, in a world of foreign invaders, of foreign gods being worshipped. And they cry out in the wilderness. These are mystics. There is a difference between a prophet and a mystic. They are etymologically contradictory. A prophet is someone who speaks, phet, phasin, Greek, who speaks forth. He is the mouthpiece of God, like the oracle at Delphi, which begins around this period, or at least that we have records of. The mystic, on the other hand, is one who is mute, muein, to be silent, to be mute. His or her journey is an interior one. It's a shamanic journey to interior worlds. Worlds inside the subconscious. One cannot speak of these worlds because their descriptions transcend language. They can only be experienced. Now, we'll have accounts, such as Ezekiel's, where mystics try to put these into words, these revelation experiences. And they come out as, beautiful nonsense. Wheels within wheels within wheels. Chimeras pulling bizarre Merkaba chariots of light. These then are taken by the vulgar and said to mean something that they could not have meant in the mind of the mystic. So we have a mystic and a prophet. These are mutually exclusive terms, but not mutually exclusive realities. And this is the time between 800 and 700 when accounts of these people start to arise. People who have visionary experiences of a true reality, a reality that goes beyond the surface, beyond the graven image, beyond the anthropomorphization of God. And they bring that truth back, and they shout from the mountaintops, "Hear ye the word of the Lord. Rulers of Sodom, give ear unto the law of God. People of Gomorrah." These are the first stirrings of the axial age beginning, the age of great teachers. the age of people with cosmic consciousness, who see the suffering brought about by the illusions that people have been led astray by, and try to shatter those illusions. I assume in a pre-literate culture, in a shamanic culture, that every man is a prophet. Every man and woman could see into these subconscious realms, and that this was bred out of man, because it did not serve a material purpose. It did not serve us on the biological level, and therefore it was swept under the rug and forgotten. So here we begin to see a return of this modality of consciousness. Of course, I don't want to say that there haven't been mystics and prophets in all times and in all places, but here we begin to have people actually writing down about them. In Greece, Apollo is worshipped at Delphi. This becomes a pan-Hellenic shrine, a shrine which is central to all Greek peoples. Delphi would become an omphalos of sorts, a navel of the world, a world mountain, if you will, like Olympus. It was a center around which the whole Greek world revolved. It's at this time that we also begin to see the legendary laws of Lycurgus, who we aren't sure if he was a real person or not, but the Greeks believed he was, so that's what's important to us. Lycurgus's reforms in Sparta. It was he who established the military orientation of Spartan society in accordance to an oracle from Apollo at Delphi. He espoused 3 virtues for Sparta. Equality among citizens, of course, not among slaves or women or foreigners or any other soul that happened to live in the area, animals, plants, etc. He espoused military fitness above all. Art fell by the wayside. And he emphasized austerity, a harsh life. They thought things like warm baths were effeminate, might be good for those philosophers and boy lovers over in Athens, but for a good Spartan, a bowl of gruel and a floor to sleep on was good enough. So it's from Lycurgus that the entire agoge, the education system which would raise young boys into warriors, which would brainwash them to become soldiers for the state, was instituted. Lycurgus is the figure to whom the Spartans would turn as a source for all their peculiarities. Freedom was not a hot commodity in the state of Sparta. And you know what? Ultimately, they have nothing to show for it. All that pain, all that suffering, all that discipline, that martial discipline, accounted for nothing. They had their moment in the light, and now they're gone. They left no art. They left nothing. Romans used to go visit Sparta in the same way that we visit pioneer villages. They would watch the men train and think, oh, that's quaint. How cute these uncivilized Spartans are. They didn't even write anything down. Now, to their credit, They allowed their women to be educated, but what good is an education if it refers entirely to the sphere of war? So, not far east from here, in this time, arts and crafts began flourishing in Asia Minor. And now these have survived for us to see. They had metal sculptures, beautiful cups and goblets, beautiful pieces of furniture, carpets, tapestries, embroideries, rock carvings. Asia Minor, under the Phrygians, under the remains of the Hittites, who had long been crushed as an empire. Sargon II of Assyria conquered the Hittites in northern Syria. He also conquered the Chaldeans in Urartu and Samaria, which ended the kingdom of Israel. But the art remained. It's like the poet Horace would say, who we just talked about. He said, Ars longa, vita brevis. Art is long, life is short. In the meantime, Greek art adapts and stylizes plants and flowers. They start to decorate their cities with scenes of nature. To me, this is very ironic. They get this from Asian art. Near Asian, of course. And this was later adopted by the Romans. We're already encountering a nostalgia for the natural world, living in our polis, among busy streets filled with slaves and merchants, soldiers, princes, prostitutes. We could say this is the equivalent of people starting to use scenes of nature as their desktop backgrounds on their computers. Just go outside. Leave your house for a minute. There is something to be said, however, about imitating nature in art. Nature is already perfectly balanced, harmonious, symmetrical. And that is what is truly beautiful. So we needn't look far. We needn't be terribly creative to create beauty, to create balanced works of art. So while this is happening in Greece, as the phusis is coming into the nomos, nature coming into law, into the city, we have ivory carvings practiced in Egypt, Phoenicia, and Samaria. We have construction of the royal palaces at Nineveh beginning. Art forms in Assyria become more naturalistic. In Babylonian music, the 5-tone and 7-tone scales both are in use. The earliest recorded music is a hymn on a tablet in Sumeria, written in cuneiform. In Greece, music is part of daily life. Chorales and dramatic music develop. Like I mentioned last session, this is a period of itinerant singers, the rhapsodes, wandering poets, like Homer. Homer was probably not a real person. Homer was more likely a movement of these singer-poets. Nevertheless, the Homeric poems that survive to us give a tremendous amount of information about this time period. We even have things like battlefield surgery referred to in Homer. As far as science and technology is concerned, we have Etruscans using hand cranks, sleds and rollers used for heavy loads. In India, medicine becomes divorced from priesthood. Medical training begins to use anatomical models. Etruscans introduced the horse-drawn chariot into Italy. Babylonian and Chinese astronomy have mapped out the planetary motions. A new calendar is confirmed. It's about this time that the Celts move into England, and it's also during this time that spoked wheels and horseshoes are in use in Europe. The Assyrians use animal bladders as swimming aids in warfare, as flotation devices. Romulus, the famous legendary king of Rome, after he killed his brother, divided the year into 10 months. This is why October, octo, isn't actually the 8th month. September, the 7th month, is not actually the 7th month. November is not the 9th, and December, is not the 10th. Because January and February were inserted at a much later date. As far as daily life is concerned, Assyrian clothing is virtually the same for men and for women. How much things have changed. Here's where we get the first recorded Olympic Games, which is 776 BC. I mean, the games probably existed since 1350 BC, but this is where the Greek calendar begins, from the first recorded Olympic Games. They're celebrated every 4th year. They feature horse racing and wrestling, boxing, pentathlons, running. It's all done in the nude, and women are not admitted as spectators. Greek culture was intensely misogynistic and patriarchal. Meanwhile, in Greece, crafts, trades, these flourish, and farmers starve. We have the first use of iron utensils, and we also have the first recorded solar eclipse in Chinese history. So this is on September 6th, 775 BC. So we've just passed our hour. I'd like to thank you for listening, and we'll pick this up next session. You've been listening to the Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, and I'm Dan Attrell. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.